Welcome to the first ever Chasing Signals. I am joined by a very drunk Peter Overzet, himself from Chasing Signals, Ben Gretch. What's up, guys?
Why don't you, Gretch, why don't you let the people know what's going on with this show right now?
Yeah, I mean, I've been coming on with you guys on the Wednesday waiver shows quite a bit. We all enjoy working with each other. Pat does an awesome stat chasing kind of a weekly video that is very similar to my Stealing Signals article in the sense that they're very stat heavy, look back type articles. A lot of the feedback that I get on Stealing Signals is people want me to roll it forward more. And a big reason why I haven't done that as much is frankly that I'm already looking at so many things that are kind of backward looking. It's just that much more time that article would take. It's hard to incorporate everything. But Pat and I often find ourselves chatting with each other through the week, and we seem to always kind of like when we hit on something, we seem to always kind of nail it. So we might as well get together, start doing a little forward-looking thing that everyone else can watch and interact with as well. That's kind of what we thought. So,
and Pat, so what can people expect going forward with Ben on the channel and this new Chasing Signals brand that we are unrolling?
Your heart is so taking the brands, smashing them together a bunch of different ways. Yeah, the for today's show, we're going to just be running through the now 2-game Thanksgiving slate. And we're going to be, I shouldn't really even say slate because it's not going to be like focused to DFS. We're basically doing kind of a preview of these games in the same way that when Ben and I are doing Stealing Signals and stat chasing, it's kind of like agnostic to the type of fantasy that you're doing. It's sort of breaking down what's going on, what went on in these games. I think we're going to now be looking ahead at what we think are some interesting trends, some interesting ways these games could break. And we're going to be doing that normally on Fridays at 4 Eastern, looking ahead at Sunday. But because we have Thanksgiving, we're doing kind of the initial kickoff here for this 2-game preview.
Yeah, we thought we'd be talking about 3 games, but we'll just do 2 games and be done in like 10 minutes. It'll be a
yeah.
Is it fair for me to say that the slate's been flipped on its head?
Yeah. I think it is fair to say that, Pete.
All right. So, I'm here. I'm just the drunk court jester to interject. So I'll let you guys do the programming you want and occasionally be an asshole. So where are we starting here?
Let's start with the Houston-Detroit game. Houston's at Detroit. We've got Houston favored by 3 points, a total of 51.5. Houston with a team total 27.25, which is the highest of the 2-gamer. Detroit at 24.25, which is basically tied for the second highest. So this game looking like potentially the higher scoring game of the 2. And Ben, let's start with Houston. What kind of jumped out to you about Houston?
Well, yeah, and I think one of the reasons we also thought it'd be fun to have Pete on is like there's really no way to get around the DFS side of this too. So like there's certainly the DFS discussion that we're going to have today with these 2 games, and it would have been a lot more fun with 3 games, but here we are talking about 2. But yeah, I mean, when like this game from a DFS perspective was going to be, probably the chalkier one of the 3 and be interesting to stack and look at. As far as like signals going into this game, you have to like what Jordan Akins is like, what we saw from Jordan Akins. I mentioned him in Stealing Signals this week. Ran a few more routes, saw a little bit more volume, and now Randall Cobb is out. And so I think Akins can help fill that short area target, not necessarily vacuum, but the open targets that come with Cobb being out. I mean, Akins is somebody that's interesting there. But yeah, I mean, I think when you're talking about a 2-game slate, it suddenly goes from I'm really, really interested in Deshaun Watson stacks to is there ways to fade them, because I think they're going to be incredibly chalky.
Yeah, and I guess the way that jumps out to me, if this game doesn't go the chalky Watson way, I mean, like you said, you can go with the Akins, and I want to talk a little bit more about the tight ends, but you can also look at the running backs. And we do have a running back here with Duke Johnson who's seeing a huge amount of snaps. Maybe not quite as many snaps as 2 weeks ago, though, with CJ Procise a little more involved. What did you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, Duke's a weird one. Duke, to me, it depends what angle you're coming at it from, because there are people who snaps are so predictive of fantasy scoring for running backs. They are essentially the most predictive thing. One reason I talk a lot about high value touches is that's actually one stat that's more valuable than snaps in certain samples. And the sample that I looked at, certainly when I came up with the stat, if you just look at touches though, touches versus snaps, people don't really realize that snaps are more predictive of fantasy scoring than even touches as far as running backs are concerned. And so Duke Johnson, if you're looking at what he's done so far and you're like, okay, he's not actually that good, then my counter would be, well, the guy had a 95% snap rate 2 weeks ago. It fell down to, I think, the 70s this past week, but he's playing a ton of snaps, right? So then you got to admit, okay, well, there's a lot of snaps here. But if you're on the side where you're looking at it and you're saying, this guy plays so many snaps, I have to jam him in, then I kind of want to take the other side of that and say, this is like the emptiest large snap roll you can have. It's not just that he doesn't get as many high value touches as we'd like to see, which is, receptions and green zone touches. And he's not getting a lot because they don't throw to the backs a lot and they don't use the backs in the green zone a lot. Deshaun Watson kind of just makes plays, but he's also not getting a whole lot of low value touches. Like, guys like Derrick Henry don't get high value touches. They can still rack up 25 plus low value touches, all these carries. And, we saw last week with Henry, he ends up going over 100 yards in overtime. And then on his 28th carry, he breaks off the long TD run and it makes his whole day, really. He ends up with 130 plus rushing yards. And you need that when you're not getting high value touches. You need the massive low value touches to rack up a bunch of rushing yards. Duke's not getting, it's not just that he's not getting a lot of high value touches. He's not getting a lot of low value touches either. It's weird. He just doesn't get many touches at all for a massive snap rate.
Yeah, I agree. I kind of feel like if Duke's going to end up being really chalky, and he has been chalky here some weeks, then it's easy enough to just move away from him. But I actually wonder if he's going to be kind of like a key leverage spot on this 2-gamer. And people, we have him in ship taking our team with Davis Maddock, and we keep jamming him into that lineup. So we're going to have a decision to make there. I think he's probably in one of the better spots so far because we just saw the Panthers smash Detroit. They're not going to have Kenny Golladay now. They're not going to have Danny Amendola, which I think actually does matter slightly. And we're even unsure if they're going to have DeAndre Swift. So we could be in a spot where Houston just kind of smashes the Lions, and that could allow Duke Johnson to succeed where maybe Deshaun Watson and Fuller and Cooks don't really get there.
I love how Pete is just interacting with the chat.
I'm the chat moderator. People are here for you for the fire takes, and they're here for me to drunkenly chat with them here.
Pat, what was your thought on CJ Procise though? I saw you mentioned him in the notes. Like, do you think he's getting interesting? I've had someone ask me, my co-manager, my other team, we won total points. We're already in the main event. We're already into the week 14 to 16 range, and we're looking for stash running backs. And he brought up CJ Procise as a stash. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not terribly interested in it. I mean, he did get 4 expected points to Duke Johnson's 11.8. So he actually had 25% of the snaps. So it wasn't nothing, but kind of another receiving back type of profile on a team that doesn't really throw to the running backs. So I'd be more interested if a Deontay Foreman type was lurking, because then you're like, all right, maybe there's a downhill rusher. I mean, we saw them kind of lean on Carlos Hyde. Obviously that was Bill O'Brien, so who knows if they would, but yeah, I think that kind of a bigger downhill type of guy would actually be more interesting in this offense. Samaje Perine is kind of the guy that's in that Procise type of dude who jumped out to me this week. We can talk about him more on Friday, but I would be more interested in Perine.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Other question I want to ask you, because I know you dig into the targets per route run more heavily on a weekly basis than I do. Sort of some of those receiving volume numbers. Where you stand on Fuller and Cooks. I've always been a Fuller guy. I am heavily exposed to him in season long and dynasty and playing him everywhere and certainly happy with what I'm getting. But I also find myself playing Cooks more in DFS. He's been a lot cheaper, and I'm not sure why he's been cheaper. They're basically on par in my mind. But lately, Cooks almost has more volume. He's been getting a lot of underneath targets. How do you differentiate those two?
Yeah, to me they're pretty equal, and I think Cooks has been clearly underpriced, but he often is more chalky. So even in DFS I've tended to be not like just like I actually really like double stacking them, and I think that'll be a really popular thing to do on this slate. But of the two, I have a slight lean towards Fuller. On the season, he leads in your stat weighted target per route run, which is targets per route run with air yards incorporated as well. He leads slightly there. And remember, with Fuller, there was the game where he was out for a while. He's kind of dealt with a little bit of injuries, so they're dead even in Whopper. But on a per route basis, Fuller leads slightly. So I think there is a tiny reason to favor Fuller. He obviously had the bigger volume this past week too. So lean Fuller. I think in Dynasty, worth keeping in mind that Fuller is not signed after this year. So be careful of investing too heavily in him there. What is every time I'm talking, you guys are just cracking up.
I'm reading Pete just writing in all caps. Like, I'm listening to what you're saying too, but Pete's just killing me right now. What are your thoughts on all that?
I have good takes. Ask me.
Yeah, Pete, what do you think? What do you think of Will Fuller versus Brandon Cooks?
So I did, this is legit real analysis. I subscribe to the Advanced Sports Analytics Substack, and they send out stuff about correlations. And Will Fuller's correlation with Deshaun Watson is insane. It's a 0.66 correlation there. So they made a really interesting point about if you're going to use Will Fuller, it should be with Deshaun Watson. Like, you cannot use Will Fuller as a one-off, especially now that it's a 2-game slate, because he's going to go absolutely nuclear. Ben is tilting because I'm making a fucking coherent ass point right now. Pretty good point.
If you're going to use a receiver, you got to correlate him with the quarterback that's throwing in the football.
Here's the thing, though. People are trying to get fancy on this slate. I'm just saying, do not play Will Fuller in a lineup with Alex Smith or Andy Dalton. I'll go back to the chat talking in all caps, you assholes.
No, I mean, it's a fair point. If you're going to go away from Watson, don't one-off Will Fuller. I see what you're saying. And you can go to like Akins, or it's like an easy way to pivot off the chalk receiver for Houston. But Detroit's the I think a pretty fun team to look at right now. I just want to talk about DeAndre Swift for like
let's talk about DeAndre Swift.
45 minutes?
Real quick before we go to DeAndre Swift, I guess one thing that I'm wondering about, and I believe this was made on the Drunken Swolecast about the tight end situation and replacing Randall Cobb, is that we could end up seeing more 2 tight end sets there. And we have Darren Fells.
Wait, did we talk about 2 tight end sets on the Swolecast?
I thought maybe you did. I think that's where I heard it. Anyway, I feel like I got drunk listening to you guys. Darren Fells has been targeted, at a decent rate per route compared to Akins, both not great. But if we ended up seeing more 2 tight end sets, I wonder if, we get a touchdown from Fells, not Akins, which is kind of all you might need.
You said Fells has been seeing more targets on a per route basis?
No, he hasn't. He's been seeing less, but it's close enough to where if they're both out there, I wouldn't necessarily have like a strong lean towards Jordan.
Because I felt like, if you know this, correct me if I'm wrong, but my thought was last year Fells was playing more snaps, Akins was seeing more targets on a per route basis, and then early this year Akins was actually playing more, and actually it looked like there might be some differentiation between the two of them where Akins made more sense because he's now playing more and he's a bet like he draws more volume per route, and then he gets hurt in week 4, and he was doing a little bit in weeks 1 to 3, gets hurt in week 4. Came back in week 9 and they've been basically splitting it in week 9 and 10. But then last week in week 11 is when we saw Akins' routes jump back to 56% of dropbacks. That was up from 40 and 35 the 2 prior weeks. It was not to his weeks 1 to 3 role, which was 80%, 83%, 79%. Like start of the year, they were like, Akins is our tight end. And it wasn't that way when he came back from injury, but it trended up last week in a way that I think that we might be headed that direction. I mean, Akins is he's actually a little older than you'd think, like 29 or 30, but Fells is like 36, 37 years old. I mean, I don't think Fells is like Akins is the one that probably makes more sense for them.
Also,
for sure.
mention too, this is a great slate to correlate your quarterback with tight end. The only tight ends that didn't correlate positively with their quarterback is Eric Ebron, who's now off the slate. Akins was the weakest correlation with quarterback, but still positive. But all of the other quarterbacks, I think on this slate, like whoever you're playing at quarterback, you should just have your tight end with them on this slate.
So
that's right.
I'm thinking about doing Watson triple stacks with Fuller, Cooks, and Akins. I think that makes a lot of sense, right? Based on what you just said.
I think so. Yeah.
And I Eric Beimfor over at Roto Grinders, he does the slate IQ. And granted, this was with the 3-game slate, but one of the most underutilized leverage constructions is the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end from the same team with a bring back. So I do think that makes sense. Like if you're going to use Deshaun Watson, like everyone is going to be playing Cooks, I think. So I think a unique leverage would be to play Fuller, Duke Johnson, and Akins in that construction if you want to go that route. Or obviously you can do that with the other quarterbacks as well. But I think people get queasy about using the running back, wide receiver, and tight end, but it's very viable now that it's a 2-game slate.
All right, let's go to the Lions. Ben, I'll kick it to you here with DeAndre Swift. Talk us through it, assuming he plays, but we also need to talk about what happens if he doesn't play.
Yeah, I haven't allowed my brain to consider that possibility. I'm just too excited. So yeah, Swift 2 weeks ago, right? We saw the star turn. We saw the snaps, really spike, and he gets almost 150 total yards on 21 touches. The key for me is what happened last week. They go down to Carolina, they get completely shut out. They get absolutely nothing out of Kerrane Johnson or Adrian Peterson. It's pretty clear to me at this point that, and I think not to me, but probably to their coaching staff, that DeAndre Swift is their best option, obviously at running back. And so I think when you're talking about, especially on a short week, I don't know that this is necessarily going to be proven out over a large sample, but I know like last week, for example, we had the Seahawks turn to Carlos Hyde coming back and use him heavily. And they activated Bo Scarborough and played him alongside him, and they didn't activate Alex Collins. There was some roster stuff related to that, but they had leaned on Collins on Sunday, and it's like, okay, short week. We don't really have a whole lot of certainty on who we are going to use. Let's use the guy who didn't actually just play 3 days ago and get beat up. And so I think there's even more of a reason to expect that if Swift can make it back for this game, because he wasn't on the field Sunday, it would make some sense for them to, even if he hadn't had the big game the week before last, to see a higher snap share than usual. So the main point for me is because he's fresh, right? So the main point for me is like he is a guy that if he gets 60% plus of the snaps, I think he should at that point project better than Ezekiel Elliott, best running back on the slate, in my opinion. He's in a great matchup with Houston. He gets the high-value touches. He catches passes. He gets green zone work. And Zeke is more like a 70% snap guy now, not an 80, 90% guy like he was once. I really do think if Swift's playing up near him in snaps, that Swift's the clear top projected running back. But he won't be projected that way because there is this possibility that he doesn't play 60% of the snaps. And my case is I think the chance that he plays 60% plus probably a lot higher than we're realizing, or maybe some will realize in the field.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, so he might have the highest ceiling on the slate, and I think that's probably true. I guess Zeke can always get into the end zone, but Swift has been having those high value touches, and if we zoom back a couple weeks, 73% of snaps for DeAndre Swift. Had that awesome breakout game. Obviously missed last week with the concussion. Had 15 plus expected points, played super efficiently on top of that. Peterson's snaps were down at 12%. It's probably bullish that Peterson's snaps were down this past week as well, and Kerrane Johnson played well ahead of him. Yep. Really nice if Peterson was phased out more or less completely, because I think Peterson has the bigger potential to hurt Swift by stealing a touchdown.
The other thing, too, I mean, we see this play out in DFS week after week. You get a discount on guys coming off of injuries or any kind of uncertainty. People don't like it. They want the prove it week. They just naturally get scared about it. If DeAndre Swift was fully healthy, he'd probably be like 90% owned on this slate. And if he's active, you might get him at like 40, 45% owned, which is a pretty big smash considering what a great play he is.
Yeah, I mean, Dalvin Cook was like 50% owned in the small field stuff last Sunday.
Who was?
Dalvin Cook.
Oh,
so
yeah.
if you're getting 45% on DeAndre Swift,
I think he'll go higher than that, to be honest.
Yeah.
I think the cat's kind of out of the bag. But I really do think the key point when you look at what Detroit did last week, they got completely shut out. They had under 200 yards of total offense. They had 5 completions in the entire first half. Marvin Jones did have a long touchdown called back by an illegal formation late in the game. I believe it was later. But like other than that play that didn't even count, they had nothing going. And so like the way I wrote that in Signals this week was it was very clear that when DeAndre Swift and Kenny Golladay are healthy, that those guys can step into a massive role. Like Detroit doesn't have a lot of pass catchers either. Hawkinson hasn't necessarily taken the big leap that I and you guys were hoping. He's been all right, but he hasn't been like a Travis Kelce type, wide receiver 1 at tight end for a team that could use that. Marvin Jones looks a little bit older, and they basically no one else is consistently good in this offense as far as receivers, and the other running backs aren't productive. Like they don't have skill talent. So Galladay's not back, but Swift is. Like, how do you not just lean on DeAndre Swift to try to win this game in a matchup against a really bad run D too?
Yeah. Let's talk about Hawkinson because he's just confounding right now. As we look at last week, he ran around on 62% of snaps, 62% of dropbacks, excuse me. He was targeted on 25% of his routes, which is pretty solid. So this has been kind of the thing with Hawkinson where he's not running a full slate of routes. In week 10, he also ran a route on 62% of dropbacks, which, ideally you'd see a tight end like that up around 75%. We see the elite tight ends, like the guys who run just a ton of routes, like Logan Thomas is up in the 90s almost every week. But, guys like Travis Kelce and Darren Waller be up in the 80s. So to have him down at 62% back-to-back weeks, it's not great, but he's getting targeted at a pretty high rate when on the field. So with Kenny Golladay out, with Danny Amendola out, and maybe with Hawkinson getting healthier because he was downgraded in practice 2 weeks ago with his toe injury. Maybe that's why he's not out there the full amount of time. Is there any chance we get more Hawkinson in this game, which I think would lead to a pretty nice game from him?
I just saw that Gio Bernard was downgraded or didn't practice because of a concussion. So you're
Gretch,
Samaje Perine.
Gretch, this is for the Friday show. This is the Thursday
or the Wednesday waiver night show.
I have consumed so much alcohol, and I'm the one keeping you guys on track.
I'm just saying, Samaje Perine is going to start next week.
Focus, Gretch. I'm going to slap you like a vaudevillian character actor.
No,
Hawkinson,
I mean, Hawkinson,
can he play more?
It's been that way all year with him. He hasn't ever run. I mean, he had an 89% routes per dropback week back in week 3, and I was stoked. And then it was back to 72% the next week. He's never been over 75% again. That's not crazy for a tight end. A lot of tight ends stay into pass block. But like you said, he's been at 62% the last 2 weeks. It's not a high number at all. And we do see some tight ends that run routes on 80% plus of dropbacks fairly consistently, and those are the ones that we want in fantasy. So it's tough. You have to be pretty efficient at that route share, both in terms of drawing targets at a high rate, which you said Hawkinson has been doing, but also catching a lot of them and generating a lot of yards and touchdowns on those opportunities. He's not probably ever going to be like a 10 target guy in this particular role, but tight end's a weak position. You can certainly still play him in a scenario like this 2-game DFS slate. He can obviously come out as a top scoring tight end. I think he'll probably be the chalkiest. I don't know what you guys think about that, but possibly be the highest owned. I think he has to project the highest, right? Am I forgetting someone?
No.
Yeah, because Andrews is gone. So I agree.
Right.
I mean, I guess Logan Thomas and Dalton Schultz will probably be somewhat popular, but yeah, I think Hawkinson.
Are we worried about this toe at all? Because he didn't seem like he was quite where he was at when he was getting 8 to 10 targets a game without the toe.
I think the toe may be a factor. I mean, he's he seemed legitimately questionable to play in week 10. And his playing time is the issue. I guess one thing I should be looking up here is his snaps. Is he getting blocking snaps, or is he just not out there?
No, snaps dip too.
Snaps dip too. Okay. So then it really might be related to the toe, because there's no reason that they shouldn't have him on the field at this point.
Yeah, he was at 73%, 74%, 76% the weeks prior, and then he went to 66, 66 the last 2 weeks. So
okay,
they dropped about 8 to 10%.
Yeah, and I think the thing, I feel like Hawkinson ultimately is going to be a product of the Lions' offense success, right? You know, like if they're humming and they're actually able to move the ball, I feel like Hawkinson will be set up for a good day. I mean, last week they literally completed 3 third downs, 3 of 13 on third down. So they just had no successful drives last week. I mean, without Golladay, he will be the guy if they can string together some drives. And Pat,
will he be though? Will he be like the clear guy?
Who would not be the clear guy?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know that anyone will be, is kind of my concern. I've been hoping that would be Hawkinson for a couple of weeks. He has been banged up, like you said, but it seems like Marvin Jones is still getting decent volume. Yeah. I mean, he had 4 for 51 last week, and again, lost a 50-plus yard touchdown to an illegal formation. That didn't impact the play. It was just somebody lining up in the wrong spot. So very easily could have had 100-yard and a touchdown type day, which would have probably changed his outlook on this slate considerably. And so Jones is actually the one that I'm looking at a little bit more for DFS. Yeah. And I think he's kind of interesting as well, as like thinking of him as the number one receiving weapon.
I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
The thing with Jones too, I mean, you know, last week he had 34% of the air yards and 11 ADOT. Ran around on 92% of dropbacks. And if you're looking at this game, it's like it's hard for me to imagine the Lions being like that healthy of an offense. And so the nice thing about Jones, just given that he is sort of the deeper threat, he could get there on a play or two, right? So you don't need Hawkinson. I do think, to Pete's point, probably need the functional offense, because he's going to be, you know, you'd hope that he gets like 7-8 targets, plays a little more than we're used to seeing, or gets in the end zone.
I do like that call from Ben, though, because Marvin Jones is just one of those guys that I think makes hand builders uncomfortable, because his production can be so polarizing. Like you can get a 2 points from him, or you can get a 30. And with being able to play whoever you want on this slate, I think people are going to gravitate to McLaurin. They're going to gravitate to Fuller, and they're going to gravitate to the Cowboys wide receivers. And I think Marvin Jones will probably end up being one of the best leverage plays on the slate.
And if they gravitate towards Hawkinson as well, right? And Swift is kind of like the Lions that they want to use.
Swift and Hawk, yeah.
Because Hawkinson obviously just adds the value that you're filling a tight end spot that's not easy to fill.
So then the question is, I think, can you play Marvin Jones as a one-off, or if you're playing Marvin Jones and he hits his ceiling, do you want Stafford there with him racking up all those touchdowns?
Probably.
I think you can use him as a bring back.
Yeah, as a bring back is what I was going to say too. You probably want to correlate him somehow, but in that scenario, isn't Deshaun Watson outscoring Matthew Stafford and likely?
Yeah. Very likely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And if it was like, if you were playing, let's say Danny Amendola was healthy, then I think you do want him probably with Stafford, because they're actually converting third downs. They're staying on the field. They actually have a somewhat functional offense. Are there any of these guys? I mean, if you want to talk about like dart throw, deep threat type of dudes, Marvin Hall is here. I mean, what is the rest of this Lions pass catching core even going to look like? We've got, you know, Quintus Cephas is around. We've got Mohamed Sanu ran around on 33% of dropbacks last week, ahead of Cephas, who was only at 23%. And we had
Cardi has Danny Amendola with a higher ceiling than a lot of guys. He has him as a ceiling at 18.7 points, even higher than Marvin Hall.
Well, he's out, isn't he?
Amendola?
I don't think he's certainly out.
I saw a report that he was declared out.
Oh, I'm gonna pee while you figure this out.
Our drunk buddy is just making things up.
Chris Burke on Twitter said,
Okay.
Kenny Galladay out and Jeff Okudah are out Thursday, along with Danny Amendola.
Okay.
So he's out.
Amendola was going to be vaguely interesting. So then I think, to go to the next Lions. Did you hear that?
Yeah, I can hear it. That's Pete pissing for everyone.
I think you go to Marvin Hall. He ran around on 77% of dropbacks last week, 65% or more in each of the last 4 games. To your point, Cephas has not been consistent in that role, and Hall has played extensively, directly inversely correlated with games that Kenny Galladay has missed. He's essentially taken Galladay's routes.
He's bad Kenny Galladay.
He's bad Kenny Galladay, exactly. Which is I'm probably not going to play him because I don't think he's particularly good, but did have a long touchdown a couple of weeks ago. I think for DF, I wouldn't play Hall in any kind of seasonal stuff. Jones is vaguely interesting in deep formats in seasonal because they do have a target opening. And for DFS, I'm mostly just sticking with Swift, Hawkinson, and Jones from this offense.
Yeah, I think that's the way to go. If we look at the other receiver here that will be filling in for Dan Amendola is probably Jamal Agnew, who was kind of in that Amendola-y role. He was not particularly good last week, and that's a bit of an overstatement. He had a yards per target of 1.7, but he ran around on 54% of dropbacks. He had a whopper of 0.59, which is not nothing, and air yard share of 29%, target share of 19%. He got 6 targets. He got volume. He did absolutely nothing with it, but I don't know. I don't know if this is a spot where you need to even consider a guy like Jamal Agnew, but if you're in some of the bigger field stuff, worth pointing out that he did have some solid volume last week and probably will again.
I'm going to have to dig into him a little bit more because he had a role pretty much all year where he was running at least 25, or maybe not at least, but around 25% of the routes. And he was at 54% last year, and he hasn't done anything. And I was pretty sure that he's basically being used as a motion man, kind of like Detroit's answer to what I think more people in the fantasy community know to be Tyler Ervin's role right now with the Packers. Mm-hmm. But the bump was there with Amendola out last week. He certainly, and you're saying he got 29% of the air yards. I didn't even notice that. So he got some downfield work. It wasn't just, I saw his really low yards per target, like you said, really, really, whatever he had, 10 yards on 5 targets or something.
8 out of 9.5. So he wasn't it wasn't 4. He wasn't exactly.
So he was actually running downfield routes. Okay.
Yeah. So he's a name to keep in mind. I guess part of it for me is if Marvin Jones is going to end up being pretty low owned here, then I'd rather be on Jones because he has the most volume. But the whopper last week was 0.49 for Agnew, 0.52 for Jones, so pretty damn close.
But again,
I don't really
no Swift, right? And so you go right. Agnew's in the Amendola role. That's short area targets. This is another reason I love Swift so much. It's not just that they're going to be run heavy. Swift has been running a ton of routes. He's been using the passing game. They've thrown to him downfield since the beginning of the year. Remember, he dropped that potential game-winning touchdown way back in, I think it was week 1. I have, a lot of optimism that he'll catch 3 or 4 passes minimum and potentially a lot in the short area of the field, which would be bad for Agnew.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, any other points on this game before we move on?
Well, there is a question here that if Swift sits, and you wanted to, that one. You wanted to talk
if
about
Swift sits. Yeah, so I think if Swift sits, well, what we saw last week was the Kerrane Johnson dominated snaps. I think he had 70% of the snaps off the top of my head, and Adrian Peterson way down. But we were in a situation where they got absolutely smashed by the Panthers, and I do think that, it probably doesn't matter because they're probably going to lose again here, but they're only 3-point underdogs, so it's not out of the realm of possibility that they actually do win this game, in which case I wonder if Peterson would play quite a bit more than we saw last week. What do you think about that?
Yeah, Peterson would if they lead. I agree with that, but I don't think I don't know. Houston doesn't have a good run D. You could make that case probably on FanDuel more than DK as well. I don't play Adrian Peterson. He doesn't get high value touches. He's 97 years old, roughly. Not a guy that I'm stoked on. Kerrane would be the one that I might mix into a couple large field GPPs, but I'd probably fade them both.
Yeah, I think that's probably right.
I think I'd fade the whole Lions offense if DeAndre Swift's out. I mean, they just were so bad last week. They don't have playmakers. They're not good.
Yeah, they really don't.
I kind of want the Lions to just flop so they just fire Patricia. Like we just have to move on for Patricia. He's awful.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Speaking of moving on, segue.
Well, one thing I'll say just on if we can't get ourselves onto Adrian Peterson because we're so, if Swift is out because we're so convinced they're just not an offense we want to be on. I do think, again, I think Duke Johnson is maybe a little interesting if he ends up being someone people don't want to play because they much rather want to play.
Yeah, he's a good pivot.
Watson.
That's a good point. Also killed my segue, but yeah.
Yeah, stepped all over your segue. But all right, now we'll move on to Dallas, Washington. I'll run through here. Dallas, the home team, they're favored by 3, 46-point total. Dallas has a team total of 24.5, basically right there with Detroit is the second highest on the 2-game slate, and then Washington the lowest at 21.5. So we've got probably the lower scoring game here, the over under 46 compared to 51.5. Let's start with Washington, Ben. Your first note here is Washington outright win. You getting psyched about them?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a bad game between bad teams. Dallas is favored at home by 3, which is just sort of the standard, and probably rightfully so. They just beat Minnesota in Minnesota. Like, there's reason to be optimistic about Dallas right now, but at the same time, they went very run heavy. They protected Andy Dalton. And things kind of came together. Minnesota didn't necessarily play a great game in that game either. Dalton only threw for 205 yards or something on 32 attempts. It wasn't like they had this big vertical pass game again. Zeke ran for 105 yards. Pollard had a 46-yard touchdown run, and they won, in come from behind fashion late. But Washington's a much better defense than Minnesota. Much better front seven. I think it's not going to be as easy for them to just necessarily run on Washington. We already saw an Andy Dalton-led team. He did get concussed in that game, but it was after the midpoint of the third quarter. For 2.5 quarters, they were an awful offense against the same Washington defense. Dalton was 9 for 19 for 75 yards, well into the second half, or at least, half the third quarter into the second half. So I think this is an interesting game. And then on Washington's side, this is a real stat that sounds made up, but since 3 weeks ago, very small sample, just from weeks 9, 10, and 11, Washington's offense has the 5th highest success rate in the NFL. Like, yeah, he likes to take the dinks and dunks, but he's been fairly accurate. They've moved the ball. They've picked up yardage where they need to. They do have reasonable playmakers, 2 of them, exactly 2, no more. In
Mckissick and
yeah, right, that guy, Antonio Gibson and Terry McLaurin. And they lost 2 of those 3 games by a field goal. They turned the ball over 6 times. They didn't generate a single turnover in those 2 games. So you lose a turnover battle, in both games. It's not going to be helpful. But they won last week. And I think they're maybe a slightly better team. Like, you'd think it'd be Philly or Dallas who's going to win this division. But, I think Washington's like the dark horse right now. They actually have a good defensive unit. It might be the best unit in the entire division. Like, none of them have good offenses or good defenses, except Washington has a pretty good defense. And then Alex Smith is, at least keeping things on schedule. It's not, I'm not trying to say he's good, but I think against Dallas especially, I think Washington can win this game.
Pete, what are your thoughts on Dallas?
Are there any other wide receivers on Washington that are interesting? I assume Terry McLaurin is going to be absolutely mega owned. If he's not getting the work, is there anyone else on our radar?
The only other guys that run a lot of routes are Cam Sims and Logan Thomas. And then you have Steven Sims, who's in a really rotational role, caught a touchdown last week. Dallas is 28th in explosive play, passing explosive play rate against, which is, certainly a positive for McLaurin. But they're also a very positive efficiency defense to play against in the short area of the field, which is where Alex Smith kind of likes to live. And that would be Steven Sims' area. As the slot guy, but he only ran routes on 41% of dropbacks last week. It was 53 the week before. But since he came back, he was at 94%, 89% first 2 weeks. He was like a full-time guy. He hasn't been anywhere near that. Cam Sims is the other outside receiver that is running 95%, 96% of the routes the last 2 weeks, but doesn't draw a lot of targets per route. right?
Yeah. Those are pretty much empty routes. Steven Sims is the Sims to own, I think, even though he's not out there all the time because at least he can draw some targets. But I think he's also getting hurt by J.D. McKissick. And J.D. McKissick is kind of this hybrid slot wide receiver running back who, if Washington trails, we've seen him just have just absurd expected points workloads when trailing because they just go to him nonstop. When leading, then you would expect Antonio Gibson to be the guy. So to your point, Ben, if Washington ends up winning this game, Antonio Gibson could be a really nice play. But we had a Peyton Barber sighting this past week. He even got a high-value carry. What are you thinking about Peyton Barber? Like, if Washington wins this going away, does Gibson fail because Peyton Barber gets mixed in the fourth quarter? That's going to be the most tilting thing of my entire life.
That would be tilting. I don't know that I'm like, I don't want to deviate from the lines too much. They are road underdogs. So to worry about a scenario where they win going away, I think in that scenario, Gibson probably already does enough. He's such a big part of their offense. So like if they are building a lead before they get anywhere toward garbage time, he's a lock to get, 15 carries and be out there plenty. And he does seem to get the vast majority of the green zone touches, except for, as you noted, the one for Barber. Barber mixes in occasionally, but I
lost them to McKissick. It's it gets frustrating.
Pat's just steamed up because Barber was stealing carries from Rojo last year.
Barber is on my list for sure.
I mean, my take on Gibson is obviously it's not elite usage, and you're right. He kind of gets squeezed from both sides, but Alex Smith has thrown to the backs a ton, and it feels like because McKissick is seeing so many targets that's a huge negative for Gibson. But his target rate has been up with Alex Smith, or maybe not way up, I don't know, but it's certainly been fine. He had 3 and 4 catches the first 2 games with Smith. He only had 1 last week when they won pretty comfortably. But I think the potential for Gibson to catch 4 or 5 balls is fine. It's solid, even though he's clearly the second most likely targeted running back. And he runs the second most routes just because Alex Smith is going to throw 40% of his passes to running backs. I mean, maybe not 40%, but a lot. And so it's kind of a rising tides thing for me. I don't think that it's a bummer that McKissick's running more routes than Gibson, but certainly there's room for Gibson to still catch a few passes. And then his only 100-yard rushing day came against Dallas. Dallas is not a good rush defense. I think certainly he could have a solid rushing efficiency day as well. So I'm certainly considering him. He's not my favorite running back on this slate, but certainly think he's an interesting guy to look at.
It is interesting because, McKissick ran a route this past week on 70% of dropbacks. So that doesn't leave much for Gibson, except that it kind of still does because McKissick's in this hybrid role and Gibson ran a route on 41% of dropbacks, which is pretty fine. Like Zeke was in for 47% of dropbacks. Kerrane last week was at 41% without Swift. So that's not nothing. It's a lot more than you would think given his snap rate. So I'm with you on that.
Yeah, when running backs, for me, with the route percentage, when they get over 40%, it's not great, but I'm okay with that. Like, especially when you have a quarterback like Alex Smith who throws to the running backs. The 30% is where I start to get concerned, and he has been below 40%, to be fair, more often than not. But again, with Alex Smith, I don't think it's that much worse than a lot of scenarios. I do think getting the Washington running back scenario right is really important on the slate. I almost feel like you have to play one of them because this is a team that generates as a team so many high value touches. I don't see a lot of scenarios where they don't have 6 to 8 running back catches. And on a 2-game slate, whoever catches more balls or where the efficiency flows, one of them is likely to be in the optimal lineup unless they both get 9 points exactly. You know what I mean?
If you guys had to choose a non-Deshaun Watson quarterback for the slate, who are you going with?
Probably Stafford, but maybe Alex Smith. I think Dalton is my last.
Yeah,
choice.
I think Dalton's probably my last too. I kind of lean Alex Smith just because I can play that for pure game script. That you can go like Alex Smith with McKissick and just play that he has a ton. He's just throwing a ton to be in catch-up mode.
Alex Smith, McKissick
with the
Alex Smith, McKissick, Terry McLaurin, Logan Thomas. Pete,
yeah,
there's your QBR.
That's where I was going too.
I honestly like it. And then what do you play on the bring back there? Do you play Zeke or do you play a wide receiver?
I think you could go either way. I think Zeke is probably the cleaner one because you're playing for Washington to basically get smashed early and then have to play catch up. But, a shootout works to your advantage just as well. I do think a shootout would probably have more Gibson than McKissick. So Zeke is probably the slight lean, but, you could go with a Cooper for sure too.
Yeah, Dallas is tough. Schultz had a touchdown late last week, and I don't know if you guys caught the game, but there was this one play early on where Schultz could have caught like a 37-yard touchdown.
I will kick you
I don't
off.
know if anyone was playing him last week in any kind of big tournaments where they maybe had money on the line. I didn't hear anything like that, but
I don't know.
It could have been like a 10-point play, which for some people might have been.
If theoretically, important. You were down 10 points in the spy.
Well, this whole Gretch experiment on the show was nice. God damn it, Gretch.
Yeah, Pete was 10 points away from banking 100,000 and had Dalton Schultz in. Apparently, I was the one to let him know that.
And you want to know how bad this is? Gretch mentioned it, or you weren't trying to needle me. You mentioned it, and I was like, "Oh my god!" And then you put a screen grab in stealing signals, and you never put screen grabs in. I was like, "This seems excessive. This seems like it's going after me." I'm like, "You never do this. Why are you doing it now?"
I couldn't describe the play very well. I was like, you know what? I want to look back at it. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to take a screen grab of this. Pete's not going to like it.
Ben, one of the most fluent writers in the industry, can't quite capture this one play.
This is the full thing. Like, so Gretch has stealing signals. Pat has stat chasing. So Gretch is showing me screen grabs of Dalton Schultz leaving points on the floor. And Pat, who I also had Denzel Mims in my lineup, and I'm like, Pat, who's the video this week? And he's like, oh, Jets wide receivers, Denzel Mims getting this like elite level usage with Joe Flacco. I had Mims in my lineup too, leaving all these points on the table. I'm like, you assholes trying to needle me, just telling me how close I was to winning $100,000. I hate you guys.
Yeah. It's it could have been one of the best days of your life, but now it's a funny bit that we have. So It works out.
But yeah, Dallas is tough. I mean, we didn't see a lot of passing production from them, but Dalton Schultz stayed involved was sort of the point there. And I think it was sharp by Pete to play him.
He was in the air yards by low model, guys.
Ooh. I don't think I can go back to Michael Gallup because I had it would have only been for, what was it, 5K, I think? I was messaging you, but I needed like less than 10 more points out of Gallup or Aaron Jones or Denzel Mims. I had the most player minutes remaining by a mile, and it didn't work out for me. But Gallup is a tough one, and Lamb's routes ticked back up. They had gone down with some extra 2 tight end usage. They were back up to 79% this past week, which was only 3 percentage points lower than Gallup. And Lamb is an elite targets per route run guy already. He was still getting targets when his routes were down. He's so good. And Cooper is obviously seeing plenty of volume that I don't think really you should go towards Gallup. I could see playing Schultz because he's a tight end. Gallup and Schultz are sort of on par for me below Cooper and Lamb, who are clearly the top two. I don't know. How do you see that, Pat?
Yeah, I think Cooper is pretty clearly, at least in terms of volume, the one. Okay. And in fact, by volume last week, Gallup was the 2. He had a whopper 0.44. Amari Cooper had 0.57, and then Lamb was third at 0.37, and lower on his routes than Gallup once you factor in the air yards with the weighted target per route run. So, because Gallup gets the deepest ADOT, even though it's come way down from when Dak Prescott was around, it's kind of like that Josh Reynolds thing on the Rams where he runs he has an ADOT of 10 yards, which is not high, but he's that makes him a clear-cut deep threat on the Rams. When you're with Andy Dalton and you have an ADOT of 11.6, you're the deep threat. Because the other guys are below 10. So I think that Gallup does have some spike play upside still. I wouldn't completely write him off. I also had him in some important lineups, and he dudded on me. So I'm not really that interested in playing him. But his whopper on the season is 0.4, and CeeDee Lamb's is 0.42. they're right there with each other. Lamb is, I think, the better wide receiver, but he has struggled to be out there all the time. Last week, as you mentioned, he was up at a higher percentage, almost where Gallup was, but that was a tick down for Gallup. And so you could have things bounce back to where Gallup's out there more. Like back in week 9, Gallup ran around on 98% of dropbacks and Lamb was at 67%. If we get that kind of usage again, I think Gallup's probably going to be the much stronger play, even though he's not going to earn targets at quite as high of a rate.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would look longer term on Lamb, though, because he only saw six targets last week. That was sort of down on his weekly targets per out run. I'm guessing because his routes had been lower and he had seen 5, 5, and 7 the weeks before. He had 11 each of the weeks before that.
Yeah, that's right. His target per out run was a little down. Well, I'm not worried about that. The guy can earn targets.
Right. So I for me, I would still have Lamb over Gallup. I can see the argument for still chasing Gallup. I was on him last week for that reason. He's seen a lot of targets over the last few weeks. It's just that I was theorizing that was because in enough routes, because they were running 2 tight end sets, Lamb wasn't out in routes. And so it made Gallup one of the clear top 2 options again. And now Lamb ran a lot of routes again. Having said that, to your point, Gallup still saw more volume this week when Lamb ran more routes. But I think over a longer sample, if Lamb's going to be running 80% routes like he did this past week, probably he earns more volume than Gallup on those routes. It's not a good thing for Gallup that they're getting to more 3 receiver route combinations.
It's definitely not because Lamb's better than him.
Yeah.
So if he's out there more, he's going to, yeah. But I think that, I would rank it for sure, Cooper, Lamb, Gallup. But if there's a gigantic gap with where the field ranks them between Lamb and Gallup, or people feel like it's, Cooper and Lamb in a tier and then Gallup way low, I am willing to kind of go the other way on that, I think.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. He's a good pivot. It does look like he's going to be a lot lower owned.
For sure. And so the game he had 12 targets, that was with Ben DiNucci, and he ran 87% of the snaps that game. The following week, he ran 94% of the snaps against Pittsburgh. Last week, he was at 86% of the snaps, and his targets keep going down, but his snaps are holding pretty steady, and we still know he has that big play threat. I think he might be a really good DFS pivot if people are gravitating to Cooper and Lamb.
Yeah, and it is a slate, right, where you can play the guys you want to play. No one's going to want to play Michael Gallup. And so if you want to, stack Dalton, or you want to do kind of like a bring back with a Alex Smith to McLaurin or whatever, or even if you're just doing mini correlation stuff here, I don't hate Gallup. I'm not excited about it either, but I just think that he might just be really low owned.
The big thing I think with Dallas, though, that I noticed this week is that they tried to run the ball a lot more, and they've been very pass heavy. They recommitted to Zeke. He ran for over 100 yards on over 20 carries on only a 70% snap rate, and Pollard still got work, right? And Pollard had the 46-yard touchdown run in the 4th. We should probably talk about Zeke, Pollard.
Yeah,
how you guys what are you thinking there? But I also think broadly, we're not necessarily going to see Andy Dalton throw 35 or 40 times, and there's so many options in this passing game. One of them can spike. That's why I said Dalton would be my last choice. It's a tough defensive matchup, and they showed last week they came out of their bye wanting to run again. I don't think that I feel comfortable enough with how many options there are in this offense to really even pick 1 or 2 to try to stack with Dalton. It makes it challenging. So that is a narrow path for me on the slate.
Isn't that Adam Levitan talks about this sometimes, where it's like the guys then just don't get picked enough because no one wants to pick them. You're just like, I don't know which guy to pick, so you kind of avoid the situation. Where I don't know, maybe I'm just talking myself into Gallup.
No,
I hate myself, but
I think I think that's a reasonable take. It's probably that they'll be lower owned, but
I also think
seasonal,
and for DFS. Yeah. I mean, when we. Like it's not even a bit. Like when you see CeeDee Lamb make that highlight reel catch, like he's gonna funnel into more lineups than these other guys. Like no one's gonna play Gallup. Like they're gonna click Lamb and then Amari and then maybe Gallup. But I mean, Lamb is gonna be the guy people gravitate to.
Yep, you're right. That catch, I was actually texting that to a buddy today that he's gonna have at least a 5% ownership bump from that catch alone.
For sure. Yeah. Well, speaking of ownership, I think there's a pretty good chance if we get Swift, maybe he ends up being the highest owned skill position guy. But I mean, Zeke looking like he's going to be very high owned, one of the clear running backs that you actually want to play on the slate. Ben, how do you feel about him? You mentioned that Pollard did get work last week, but they also seem to recommit to the running game. So it's a sort of a good news, bad news type of thing. With Zeke, they're favored. This could set up for them with a nice game script to where they can ride Zeke. They're home. How do you feel about Zeke, considering he's probably going to be super chalky in DFS?
I'm probably going to be pretty underweight on him. I can't completely fade him. I don't think you can on a 2-game slate, but a big reason he was so valuable earlier is he was catching a lot more balls this year. He ran at least a route on at least 50% of dropbacks in each of the first 8 games, and often was over 70%. In week 9, he was down to 45%, and then they come out of the bye week 10, and in week 11, he's at 47%. That 70% snap rate I keep talking about, to me, it's like, okay, well, yeah, they're still committing to him. He's still their workhorse. He still can catch some balls, but they are incorporating Pollard more, and he's earned more work. And because of that, Zeke doesn't necessarily have, for me, enough of a receiving ceiling to really, insulate him from potential poor rushing efficiency. Now, we know he can also be efficient running the ball, so it's not like he's going to guaranteed be bad. And last week he had 100 yards and a touchdown, right? No, he didn't score, but 100, or he caught the TD. That's right. Didn't get a rushing TD, caught a short touchdown, but he only had 2 catches. He's only had 6 catches over the last 4 weeks. He had 6+ catches the four of the 5 weeks before that. So I don't think we have that receiving ceiling. You basically need a 100-yard rushing day. You probably need a rushing touchdown for him to really be like a smash play. I think he's a reasonable fade against Washington because Minnesota is not particularly difficult to run against. And at this point, he's just not this clear workhorse guy. I mean, he played snap rates over 90% earlier this year, and he's nowhere near that right now.
Yeah, he opened the season with snap rates of 88%, 93%, and then 98%, and he has been above 80% just once since. That was back in week 5. He had 78% back in week 8, but he's been in the last 2 weeks at 65% and 70%. So really seeing his snaps fall off. I was thinking maybe that had to do with the injury. He's dealing with this hamstring tightness or whatever, but coming off the bye, still only playing 70%. He's definitely not going to be like that workhorse where he's getting just a ton of snaps, elite snap share like we thought he would be heading into the season. I don't think that's really in the cards anymore. Pete, where are you at on Zeke for this 2-game slate?
Yeah, I'm interested to see where his ownership shakes out. I think just because it is so easy to just build lineups with whoever you want, that people are going to feel comfortable playing Zeke with one other running back, and people aren't going to want to play Dalton. So I actually think the Dallas pass game might be the way to attack this slate just based on ownership.
Or just fading them. If you think So Leone has a comment here. Have I seen the options in the slate? It's funny. I was cracking up at it. I will play Zeke some. But when I say underweight, one of the things I think a lot of people are going to gravitate towards is 3 running back builds. I think you can differentiate by adding a 4th receiver. We do know they're higher variance, and it helps your stacks too. I don't see any real issue. If you go with Watson in a double stack, you can add in 2 more receivers still. And so my 2 running backs would then probably be Swift and whichever of the Washington running backs I prefer, because I really do think the Washington running back getting that right could end up being huge.
When you say getting that right, do you think is that game script dependent? If you think Washington's front running, you play Gibson, and if you think they're behind, you play McKissick, or is it not that simple?
It is.
I think it is that simple.
Yeah, it is that simple. But the reason for me saying it that way is Washington now is 2nd in the NFL behind only New Orleans, who's always super high in high value touches. And particularly lately, they've led the NFL over the last 4 weeks, which is the other time period I have. It's not just to cherry pick Alex Smith's games, but they've led the NFL in high value touches while Alex Smith has been their quarterback. That there's going to be receptions, especially on DraftKings, but even on FanDuel, they're a half point. There's potential for 8 to 10 reception games for these running backs when Alex Smith is the quarterback. That's a lot of points that are out there. So one of them probably gets there is sort of the logic.
Yeah.
All right. Should we wrap this up, guys?
Yeah.
I think so.
let the people know, give them idea of a taste of what's to come. We're also going to be back later tonight, but let people know what to expect from this show, Chasing Signals, going forward.
Yeah, we're going to be back on Friday at 4. We will not spend a half an hour on each game, I promise. And we're going to be going through doing a preview of all the Sunday games.
Yeah. Every week, and probably not as much of a DFS slant. We just did that because it's Thanksgiving. Obviously, we want to do that. We're going to talk seasonal. We're going to talk, maybe, betting markets, prop markets, whatever we think is interesting, but mostly like what we're seeing in the trends, what we think is what guys are peaking, what guys are fading, for your start sit decisions. We're getting into the playoff season, but also for bets, for DFS, for anything.
Yeah. And you guys won't have to deal with me on Friday. It'll be just these two guys. I had to hop on for my drunken day of streams. I had to get my count up. I had to be able to say I did 5 shows absolutely hammered today, but we are very, very excited to have Gretch coming on more and doing shows with us. One of our favorite dudes. And also Pat, a little preview tonight. 6 of our 8 teams in high stakes contests have made the playoffs, including one with Ben, our robust OG team with Ben and Sean Siegel. So tonight we will talk about our playoff push. We are going to win some ships. When you name your show Ship Chasing, you must win some ships, and that is what we were going to do. So we will see you guys back at 9:15 p.m. Eastern. Ben, you're joining us, right?
Yeah, I'm gonna jump on that too. Fun week.
And we're going to be doing our waivers as always, and hopefully we'll find some under the radar guys that could be nice pickups this week. What do you think?
That's right. As Nick Charman says, Buddy Howell and a GPP. Thank you guys for tuning in. Smash the subscribe button. Smash it. Watch Stat Chasing. Read Stealing Signals. This has been a new show, Chasing Signals with Ben Gretch and Pat Kerrane. We'll see you guys at 9:15 p.m.